Okay, today I'm speaking with Dr. Dirk Johnson. Dr. Johnson received his PhD in German studies from Indiana University in 2000. In 2010, Cambridge University Press published his book, Nietzsche's Anti-Darwinism, which deals with Nietzsche's relation to Darwin and the sciences. More recently, he wrote a piece called Zarathustra, Nietzsche's Rendezvous with Eternity, which appeared in the New Cambridge Companion to Nietzsche. His articles on Nietzsche, Darwin, and Darwinism have appeared in multiple journals. Dr. Johnson, how did you first become interested in Nietzsche's work?
Well, I was in Germany at the time. I was about 20 years old, and right out of college, I had moved to Germany and didn't know how long I was going to stay. Ended up staying for 7 years, studying at the University of Bonn and getting a master's there in political science, philosophy, and German. But while I was there, I just by chance picked up a book by Nietzsche. I'd always wanted to read him. I don't think I ever read him in college, actually. And since I speak fluent German, I picked up the German copy of Human All Too Human, Menschliches also Menschliches, and I was just taken in, sucked in by the book and the ideas he had there. And I then over time, bought his other individual works and sort of, I can't remember in what order, but just went through all of them over time. And basically, I just he never let me go in the sense that I continued to be fascinated by him and what he had to say. I love literature in general, and I teach and studied literature. So for me, I liked also his very literary approach that he knew clearly. For me, it was like an immersion into someone with a vast culture, and I felt like that was something I aspired to be able down the line to have, read in depth so much that he showed in his works. And classical works and everything else like that. So basically, I was drawn in by that. And what I've always appreciated about Nietzsche is that I always come back to him. I always basically, it's not like one of these writers that you can just sort of, okay, I've done with it and I'm, move on to the next person. It just stuck with me and it continues to speak to me. Although I continue to read, of course, across the board and literature and other things as well that interest me. So it's not only, I don't want to sound like that's all I do is read Nietzsche. It's just that I find him of more modern readers, more modern readers, one of the most fascinating and one that I always return to.
Didn't Nietzsche actually teach at that university?
No, he taught at Basel. He taught at University of Basel in Switzerland.
Ah, yes,
That
yes.
was his longest time. Was his one and only time at a university was in Basel. But oh no, but he did go. You're right that he went there to study. That was his first school that he studied at.
Yeah,
Did you say
yeah. I
study or
wasn't.
teach?
It sounded familiar, and I wasn't sure if he taught there or if he studied there. But the university did sound familiar
Yes.
in relation to Nietzsche.
Sorry if he did study there for first several years, and then he moved over with his mentor Ritschl to Leipzig, where he ended and promoviert, as the Germans say, graduated basically, and that from there he went to Basel to teach.
Mm. Yeah, I think what you were saying, I definitely sympathize with. I think Alan Bloom, he was a student of Leo Strauss.
Hmm.
He went and said that people have one of two reactions to Nietzsche, and it's either indifference or obsession. And for me, it's definitely been like the latter. I first read Nietzsche when I was about 16, and he's one of the few writers who I actually do always come back to. I might not read him for some time, but I always come back to his work. Um, so today we're going to be talking about Nietzsche's relation to Darwin and the sciences, because that's sort of your area of specialty. But before we do that, we might just talk about the sort of scientific culture
Hmm.
of the second half of the 19th century. In your book, you argue that an insufficient amount of attention is given to Nietzsche's historical context. Maybe we'll just begin by talking about that context, the second half of the 19th century.
Well, when I speak about context, I really also mean just the larger 19th century, and it's really drawing out of the 18th century. So Nietzsche is basically matures and as a young man more at the beginning of the 19th century. Sort of romanticism, the whole sort of worship of culture and the study of the classics, the philology of the time. So, and of course, he went into philology and was inspired by the writers who were writing about antiquity. People like Goethe, of course, Schiller, Winkelmann, Hölderlin, all these great writers of the early 19th century were imbued with classical learning, and so was Nietzsche. So when he went to the University of Bonn and later Leipzig, he studied philology under probably the greatest philologist in Germany at the time, Ritschl, and philology at the time was a science. I mean, it was a very, very precise. Probably never again will classical studies be pursued with such rigor and attention to detail and to the historical context. So his real training is in philology, and we have to repeat that is a science. In fact, my upcoming work will deal with that aspect of his training and of his outlook. But you're right to point out that in his later years, Germany was changing, and it was happening already during his time at the university, was changing to a much more scientifically imbued institution, and the society itself was much more engrossed in the natural sciences and its viewpoints toward society and man. So he really straddles this older tradition that predated him and is then culminates, or his final years are in this very new contemporary setting of the late 19th century, which is much more dark and sort of more dark in the sense that the natural sciences are being really used to explore a lot of social questions. That was new, I would say, to his later years. But he was interested in that as well, or he was wrestling with those questions that were addressed at that time as well. But when I say the sciences, I do think one has to keep in mind the earlier tradition and the earlier experience he had, and then how we apply that to questions that arose in the later century.
Mm. The way that I think about it is the 1700s sort of end with this immense optimism that we associate with the Enlightenment, and that I
Right?
guess that manifests into the French Revolution. But
Correct.
fast forward 100 years, that optimism is replaced by a sort of a pessimism, and
Yes.
increasingly what we see is people, the concept of sin and virtue, I guess, of being replaced by concepts of sickness and health, which is
Correct.
definitely new. I mean, the idea that society is degenerating is not new at all. It's not unique to any age. If you go and look at history, there's always someone speaking about the decay of morals and so on and so forth. What is new is the sort of explanations for it. We find these degeneration theorists who basically start to explain things that would have traditionally been explained by theologians. Like, let's take something like alcoholism and prostitution. Like, these things are increasingly explained as, yeah, a form of sickness rather than a form of sin. Um, so maybe we'll speak a little bit about degeneration theory.
Hmm. Well, okay. So what you raise an important point, and I think what's unique about Nietzsche is that he explores the question as a cultural question. And you raised the point; it isn't new. It's, the idea that society is decaying, that the empire, the Roman Empire, is going down because of mixed races or whatever. You find that kind of rhetoric throughout human history, and particularly in periods of great anxiety and changes in the social and cultural fabric. Nietzsche was aware that he was living in such a time, in the beginning of such a time. The optimism of the 18th century, the Enlightenment optimism, was now all of a sudden being displaced by replaced by a sort of a darker view of the decline of civilization. Um, but what I think is unique, what he remained pretty sane about it, because what he did was look at it from a cultural point of view, and he said, you know what, this rhetoric is repetitive, and it's coming from certain parts of the population that are fearful, that have anxiety about where they stand in the society, where the society is heading. Nietzsche sees this as emerging from the lower classes, and his criticism is generally that these voices are coming from these existentially imperiled groups, and what's new is they're using new language for it. They're using medicalized language, no longer religious language, for example, as you mentioned. So they're using these terms to state the exact same thing, but they now think it's based in scientific theory and in truth, right? It's no longer religious truth. It's a scientific one. Whether it has therefore more validity or not, that's up to each individual to decide. But Nietzsche, I don't think is really interested in terms of its scientific import or validity. He's interested in as an expression of a cultural malaise.
Mm, yeah. I think it'd be interesting to speak a little bit about some of those scientific thinkers of the time. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I thought maybe it would be interesting to start with Cesar Lombroso, who I think is widely credited as being like the father of criminology. Now, what he would do is look at skulls, and
Mm-hmm.
he would identify certain skulls as atavistic. And he would say, if we look at this criminal type, what we find is they have a skull that resembles that of perhaps an ape, or it's closer to our ape ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm curious, what do you think Nietzsche would have thought about a practice like this? Sorry, yeah, I'll get your answer first, and then we'll.
Okay. Well, I first of all, before our talk, I mean, in my upcoming book, I basically a lot of these scientists really don't make entry into his published work. They barely make entry into his reference notebook. So, despite the fact that he was interested in the cultural context and in some of these theories and some of these writers, very few actually find entry, not even into the notebooks. So we have to be careful when assessing too much importance to some of these thinkers and think that Nietzsche knew them or knew them well. For example, you mentioned both Galton and Lambroso are both not even in the index to the in his collected works in German. So based on that, I would assume that he didn't even make a reference to it in his entire work
Mm.
or
The
briefly.
thing that the
Um,
thing that made me think about Lombroso was the line where he's talking about Socrates and how ugly Socrates is. And
right,
there's
right,
anthropologists specializing in crime tell us that the typical criminal is ugly, monstrous in
right,
appearance, monstrous in spirit. And as soon
right.
as I read that, I couldn't help but think of Lombroso, but more, I guess, of like the practice of what like we'd call physiognomy more broadly. And there's
Right.
also that line in Genealogy of Morals
Hmm.
where I'm paraphrasing this now,
Sure.
where he's talking about the return to the commune, how a certain type of person has become ascendant, and then he mentions the forehead, and both of those struck me as very much like a inspired by what people like Lombroso. I'm not saying that he read Lombroso. I'm just saying
Right.
that Lombroso would have inspired a movement at the time. I don't know. So I was
Yeah,
hoping.
you're right that those. In fact, that's good that you mentioned that, because it's not necessarily someone that he read in great detail and knew well, but there do seem to be traces of those kind of ideas, and it's inevitable that there would be some traces because of as the context that you mentioned at the late, and those are the works that appeared in his are his latest works. So 1866 to 1888, those are the period when he was referring to those terms. Um, what One has to approach also those terms with great skepticism or caution, because a lot of the discourse that he's doing is that he's also undermining some of those discourses as well. So, for example, Socrates is for him the paragon of science, and Socrates was also, worshipped at this point. Socrates was seen as the acme of Greek civilization. So by taking that terminology, and using it against Socrates, he's basically saying, well, using your own rhetoric, Socrates would be a decadent. So Nietzsche is always very playful and very, you can never pin him down to any one position, precisely because he's constantly working with a lot of different ideas on different levels. And he's also, his targets are always sort of moving targets that he keeps on using the rhetoric to sort of highlight something, but it won't be as straightforward as one would think. So I don't want to go into detail about those particular passages, but I would say that one has to be a little bit skeptical or cautious when seeing it straightforwardly as a validation of those theories.
All right, so that naturally, it's a good segue to talk about Nietzsche's attitude towards the scientific culture of the 19th century, because on one hand, he clearly appears to admire it. Again, I'm paraphrasing, but if we think to the beginning of Genealogy of Morals, he talks about the need for a fruitful exchange between the sciences and philosophy, psychology, so on and so forth, theology, all areas of inquiry, which would very much suggest that he is a man who appreciates science and as a scientific thinker. On the other hand, he sort of describes science as a resentful force. Likewise, he's a critic of the Enlightenment, but he dedicates a book to Voltaire. So what are we to make of his attitude towards science?
Well, first of all, I'll go back to what I said earlier, which is that for me, and this is what I argue in an upcoming book, that basically for me, when Nietzsche talks about science, he's talking about philology. That for him, that's his exposure to science. That is his science. We tend to, especially in the Anglo-American world, think science means natural science. The German word Wissenschaft applies to all sciences, applies to the humanities as well. That is, that anybody who has an objective view by looking at everything from a non-moral, non-judgmental point of view is looking at it scientifically, is wissenschaftlich. So we have to see the context of that under awareness of what science actually means in the German context. For some reason, we in the West, or actually specifically in the Anglo-American realm, just automatically assume science means natural science, and it gives a validation to natural science that is not accorded to the humanities or to levels of inquiry that are more humanistically driven. And so what I'm arguing is that Nietzsche understands science that way. Now, that means natural science itself is a human inquiry, it's a human endeavor. And basically what Nietzsche ends up doing is asking what drives a person to look at certain questions, what drives a person to see nature in a certain way. And so what philology allows him to do is to find irrelevant the question of truth or the question of scientific truth, but rather what does the viewpoint that the individual investigator have say about that investigator? Where is that coming from? And so there is where he starts using these newly acquired and newly new approaches to the sciences, to medicine and to the physiology, to understand that morality itself is something that is derived from the instincts. And that's where we get this kind of a language of instincts and drives and everything that's related to it, where he does seem to come across as a natural scientist, when in reality he's exploring the roots of our moral presuppositions.
We're going to speak about Darwin, but before we do that, we might speak about Paul Rée, who I knew really nothing about. All I knew was that he was pictured in that photo, that famous photo of them like driving the car with what's her name, Lou Simone in it. I think is he pictured in that photo. But anyway, it turns out that he was
Lou Salame, yeah, Lou Andreas Salame.
yeah, yeah, yeah. He was a German Darwinist. Is that correct?
Right. So basically, Rée, he met Rée, and almost simultaneously to his encounter with Lou, or actually, Rée introduced him to Lou Salame. Um, and at that time, had befriended Rée, and it was right at the time when he was starting to really have doubts about Wagner and removing himself from the Wagnerian orbit, and questioning a lot of the assumptions that had led him to Wagner and sustained him for almost 10 years. But in that time, he was already starting to have gnawing doubts about Wagner's project and what that meant. And Rée's approach appealed to him because Rée was inspired by the Enlightenment moral, what I call them, the moralists. That's what they call them. We call them moralists, and I like the French term. I'll use the term moralist, but moraliste really is a tradition in the French culture of people like La Rochefoucauld, Vauvenage, Chamfort. These are people that approached human motivation from a very sort of a cynical point of view and seeing everything driven by egoism. Yeah, so sort of all ideals were basically masked egoism, and we conceal that to ourselves. And so Rée, well, was really much more influential than we give him credit for. He deserves more credit because he really did push Nietzsche in a new direction, or allow him to discover a new direction. Even if he eventually distanced himself from Rée and from his perspectives. But he should be accredited for performing that service to Nietzsche, which really left a lot of traces in the whole middle period work. So everything from Human All Too Human to The Gay Science. But during this time, Nietzsche was starting to explore the questions that Rée raised for him in different ways, started to look at it from different angles. And then started coming to his own newer assessments of some of those questions. But Rée was a friend and was someone who was sympathetic to Nietzsche's approach and vice versa. And as you mentioned, he was also an early Darwinist. In other words, he looked at the question of morality from a Darwinian perspective and seeing morality having derived from the practice of punishment. And that definitely leaves its marks in the genealogy of morals, even though Nietzsche claims that, he basically, the whole genealogy of morals is a rejection of, or a challenge to that approach. But in order for him to do that, he had to have been completely schooled in that approach by working with Rée and those ideas for a 10-year period.
Didn't he write a book? What was the title of the book that he wrote?
Of Rée's?
Yeah, that's right.
One of them was Psychological Observations, Psychologische Beobachtungen, and the other one was Origins of Our Moral Sensations, I think.
And Origins of Our Moral Sensations, Genealogy of Morals, like the titles bear a sort of similarity, right? So you can see the influence there, and I guess they're both on the Origins of a Species. They've all got similar titles.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Okay, well, I guess now we'll speak a little bit about Darwin. So that's the name we haven't mentioned yet, and someone you wrote extensively about. So perhaps maybe you could begin. I've never read The Descent of Man, and I think that that's perhaps the most relevant book in regards to Nietzsche. Perhaps you could just begin by giving a short summary of Darwin's Descent of Man.
Well, it's, of course, I'd have to simplify it quite a bit. I mean, it's been years since I read it cover to cover. Of course, also much more interesting is the first part. So there are two parts. The first part is the origin of morality and of man, and the second part is about sexual selection, and that one is. It's quite interesting, and I think people still refer to it and like the ideas there. But the much more important work is the first part of The Descent of Man. And a lot of people think, oh, Darwin, sort of discovered evolution and was interested in an evolution because of man, and it was already the origin of species. Well, really, the origin of species is where he sets out the theory of descent and natural selection, irrespective of man. He doesn't really touch upon man as such, more about other animals and other species. It's then in the descent of man where he sort of applies that theory to man and sort of tries to explain how man evolved, right? So the evolution of man and humankind from simpler origins, more rudimentary origins, was really, he tries to explain that based on his theory of natural selection in the earlier work of The Origin of Species, where he has the theoretical tool, natural selection, to apply that to humankind and give that explanation for it. Because, I mean, let's face it, who cares about this theory of evolution if it doesn't apply to man, right? So, I mean, who's going to read a book about every other species except man, right? So why does Darwin do that? Well, I mean, because it's on everybody's mind, and probably also wanted to stop other people from theorizing about that, and wanted to put his own stamp on his own master theory and using it to explain man's evolution. But other people were doing it already, right? So we're already starting to think along those terms, but we care about what Darwin had to say about it because he came up with a theory. So he does it for that reason, I think, too. And then also on top of that, social Darwinistic ideas are starting to also come out, and there's this also anxiety that if you look at natural selection, it's a pretty brutal take on what the animal world, what the natural world is about. So and social Darwinists were already starting to apply it on the natural world, on the environment, and saying, the survival of the fittest, dog eat dog, red in tooth and claw, and so Darwin had probably felt like he didn't want his theory to be taken in that direction necessarily, and he wanted to be the one who puts a stamp on it. So his theory basically, and it's of course I'm going to have to simplify it a great deal, and this is also how I understand it. Other people might see it in a different way, but for me the importance of that is how he describes how morality emerged. In other words, how the paradox inherent in his theory of natural selection is, how do you explain development of mankind, which, by the way, basically implies morality in itself, because we are now more quote unquote civilized, and back then we were not. So how did that emerge if natural selection actually says we have to basically just we'll do anything for our individual survival? How could we have evolved to what we are now? So it was implicit in the question, or in the theory itself, that you had to come up with some sort of explanation for that. So what Darwin does is introduce this notion of group selection. So group selection is basically, he implies that there's an instinctual sympathy in man, which he says, that sort of competes with the other instinct of self-preservation. And those units that showed more sympathetic sense would bond together and prove more successful in the survival than those who were just totally ego or self-centered and looked out only for self-survival. So with time, those tribes and that group selection was selected out over time and won out over, or was able to just transplant these kind of beings that were completely self-serving or egotistical. So that's where we get into this notion of altruism, egoism. So the altruism emerges out of this so-called instinct of sympathy, which is an interesting term, because, I mean, I guess you can say we have an instinct for sympathy, but what does that really concretely mean? It doesn't make any much sense to me. But basically says that this instinct of sympathy won out over, or was able to, over time through the group selection, gain predominance, and over socialization occurred, which reinforced that. And of course, it's a long spell out process. So yeah, I mean, Darwinists find that perfectly acceptable, makes sense. It would explain the emergence of morality and the evolution of man. But his whole idea of how man evolved is based on this theory, right? And applying it. But what I argue is that what Nietzsche was, what Darwin was using was this notion of egoism, altruism. So altruism means essentially, as you probably know, the idea of helping others, right? Not only caring about your own individual self, but this sort of altruistic instinct, so-called altruistic instinct, is helping others. And this idea of altruism, egoism, actually was an ongoing discussion out of the moralists. So here we go. Here we see this coming together of Rée and the French moralists and the British moralists. This notion that there's such a thing as egoism and altruism. That man is essentially only selfish, and idealism and altruism is also at a core egotistic, right? And so Darwin's theory is an extension of the whole idea that there's such a thing as altruism, egoism, right? It's just a scientific elaboration on that theory of altruism,
And
egoism.
and the
Go on.
idea that it's just the idea here is that nature has sort of selected altruism, right? It's helping people survive. Another thing I want to just talk about in regards to the descent of man, we talked about these sort of anxieties that begin to emerge at the end of the 19th century. Um, I just wanted to tell a quick story for the listener, which
Sure.
might be interesting.
Sure.
You may have already heard of it, but I think during the Boer War, the British couldn't find enough soldiers to fight. And what they were finding, the reason they couldn't recruit enough soldiers is because not enough people could pass the fitness standards. And they noticed that in the industrial centers like Manchester, almost no one could, well, not no one, but you get what I'm saying. Very
Right.
few could pass these standards. So these anxieties begin to emerge about the man's relationship to industry, but also degeneration, right?
Right.
The race is degenerating. It's also, I think, in Victorian England, the average family would have about 6 kids. In
Right.
Edwardian England, it'd be 3. And so there's these, again, concerns about vitality and fertility, which I find this really interesting because you begin to realize there's nothing new under the sun. People have similar anxieties today. And the interesting question in
Absolutely.
regards to Darwin is, did he endorse his view or not? And I think there's this quote. Again, I haven't read it, so I might be taking this quote out of context, but it just says, if the various checks do not prevent the reckless, the vicious, the otherwise inferior members of society from increasing at a quicker rate than the better class of men, the nation will retrograde, as has occurred too often in the history of the world. We must remember that progress is no invariable rule. So my question is, what was Darwin's view of degeneration? Was he a degenerationist?
Well, you picked a quote there, and there are, I would call them problematic quotes in his text, even though it's hard to pinpoint a complete support for those positions. I mean, there are people who are highly critical of Darwin who see those and see that as a sign of a sympathy with that position. But I mean, Darwin also has other remarks that maybe are less stark. But it is hard to sort of absolutely pin him on the position of degeneration based on what he wrote. That didn't stop other people from taking in that direction. And there, the whole larger question is: does Darwin give the framework for that kind of a questioning, for people to take it in that direction, even if he himself did not? Now, of course, Darwinists, pure Darwinists now who support him, don't want to be associated with those. I would sort of say un-PC comments because they want to make him seem like he's absolutely scientific and doesn't share those ideas, right? Although I would point to those and say, yeah, he did. He's a man of his time, and maybe not as strongly as others, but had those ideas. Now, one thing I just came to me right now is it's interesting how he does frame that in the quote that you gave, because in many ways the actually natural selection requires a lot of births, right? It requires a lot of natural selection can only work if there are it's based on procreation, and then quote unquote nature selecting among that the one that is supposed to be selected, so to have something to work with.
Mm.
And you don't know what's going to be chosen, so to speak. It's just whatever is chosen in a way, right? So it's funny that that one would be sort of against it in certain classes, and yet uh, promoting it in the so-called higher superior classes, when in actuality nature doesn't really care about class. It cares just give us something to work with. It's proven time and time again that it's a lot of times not the sort of the so-called Nietzschean lucky strikes do not occur in the higher classes, but
Mm.
so you can see there's actually maybe some agreement there that a lot of times bastard children of
Mm.
are become geniuses, right? Despite the circumstances.
Okay, so already just based off what you just said, we kind of it's an appropriate segue to talking about Darwin's relationship with Christianity, because obviously he was seeking a naturalistic rather than a transcendental explanation
Mhm.
of morality, which would put him at odds with Christianity, at least at the time. So, what was his relationship with Christianity?
Very problematic, or I think early on, he felt that he didn't identify with Christianity anymore. I mean, he was losing his Christianity. That's of course not uncommon in the 19th century. A lot of people were in a similar situation, including Nietzsche himself. So mid 19th century, or even early 19th century, you have people losing their faith, their traditional faith. Schopenhauer, who was his contemporary, was obviously someone exactly in the same situation. And Schopenhauer also sort of admired Darwin. But anyway, the it was not uncommon, and he was, but I think he had. I mean, I don't want to psychologize because it's just not appropriate, but I think he did have very strong sort of. Um, how would I put it? Like basically, he had doubts, or it was difficult for him to come up with a theory that he knew would basically give Christianity the death blow, right? I mean, it's something, you know, the weight of that awareness must have weighed hard on him. He was not ignorant of that fact. He was quite aware that this was going to be sort of yeah, the death knell to Christianity, or give people who are unchristian a basis from which to remove themselves more completely from Christianity. On top of that, we know that his wife was very Christian, and he did not, and their relationship was very strained as a result of that. She remained a believer. She knew obviously he wasn't, and I guess I don't know what their agreement was, but it wasn't a very happy marriage, is what I've heard, as a result of, as partially as a result of that, and I think that he also suffered a lot of psychosomatic illnesses that were never really, no one really knows what caused them. I think a major stomach condition or something that you have to read that psychosomatically, that there's probably a lot of pressure on him, knowing what he was doing, knowing where his theories were leading him. And so despite the fact that he was clearly more or less an atheist, it's hard to think otherwise. It wasn't an easy position to be in.
And as we'll get into later, perhaps that Christian worldview lingered more than he thought.
Mhm.
So we're going to talk now about Nietzsche's relation to Darwin. The book that you wrote is obviously called Nietzsche's Anti-Darwinism. But before we do that, I think we want to talk a little bit about Nietzsche's conception of the self.
Okay.
If we think about traditional views of the self, perhaps we can think of Plato's chariot allegory, where
Hmm.
you have the charioteer who represents the self, consciousness, maybe the thinking mind, reason, and then you have the two horses. One represents good instincts, like um, self-righteous, righteous indignation, and then the other horse represents bad instincts, which might be
Hmm.
lust or something. Now, the charioteer, the self, the consciousness, whatever, that's in the driver's seat. But what we
Hmm.
start to have in the 19th century, and perhaps earlier, maybe you can trace this to Hume, but
Hmm.
we have this idea almost more most clearly articulated by Schopenhauer, right? That
Hmm.
no, the self, the reasoning self, isn't in the driver's seat. It's this will, right? This will to life that directs
Hmm.
us, and we're just its slave. That's what's
Hmm.
really in the driver's seat. And Nietzsche has a similar conception. Maybe this is what he took from Schopenhauer, right? Is that I guess you could call him like a will psychologist. Maybe that's how we would speak about him today. That we're driven by forces or instincts,
Hmm.
and that maybe in most people, there isn't just one instinct. There's multiple instincts. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is like how how does Nietzsche's conception of self deviate from his predecessors?
Uh, Quite radically, I would say, and this is the result of his explorations in the middle period, where he starts to question all of Western philosophy eventually, based on this false notion of the self, seeing at the root of many misconceptions about man and about morality, because he sees that the self has always been at the center of philosophical exploration. But Nietzsche begins to question that that there's this autonomous self, that there is a thing, such a thing called the self. He says it's a I don't want to say phantasmagoria, but it's basically something that is result of the instincts, and the instincts in relationship to each other. So we think we are a self-contained willing unit, but the will, he says, is something that is just a word for something that cannot be explained. It's something, there's so many things going at a deep subconscious level that that cannot be encapsulated in a single word, in the simple concept of the will. Um, so he's beginning to basically deconstruct this whole Western notion of a willing, autonomous subject, which of course then gets at free will. How can you have a free will? There is only, we are not free wills, because we aren't in control of our wills, or basically our instincts are are what are released. What we term the will is only our interpretation of instincts that have been released, that we think we have determined, when in reality they are fatalistic. They will release themselves how they want, and we then give this post facto interpretation of actions that we couldn't have done otherwise, if that makes sense to you.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And
So,
I
so that, for example, and I use in my book, basically, I reach for the water because, I didn't run the red light, so, therefore I'm a moral person. Well, you didn't run the red light, and that's it. Whether you judge it to be moral or not, that's irrelevant. It just, you did that anyway, right? The moral interpretation is that somehow you could have done differently, or you would have done differently. That's, you didn't do differently. Your instincts didn't do differently. If you want to interpret it as being superior because you did it, that's just an interpretation. There's something, another instinct inside of you that's telling you shouldn't do it.
mm.
So it's basically below the level of the consciousness. There's already this conflict going on, and what ultimately is released is the dominant instinct. What is actually happening, whether or not it's moral or not? What did it is just an interpretation.
And the dominant instinct is what he talks about types, certain types, the priestly type,
Right.
the warrior, the Aryan, and
Right.
essentially uh, that's determined by the dominant instinct within the individual. So we can think. I think that he considers, so his conception of decadence. His conception
Right.
of decadence would essentially be someone who doesn't have a dominant instinct, someone who is constantly being pulled in 1,000 different directions by different instincts,
Right.
whilst within well, the priestly type, which he also views as a decadent. So already I'm contradicting myself. But anyway, like these people have an overarching instinct, right? The instinct. A good way might be to actually try and spell it out with an example. If you think about a priest sublimates their sexuality to spiritual ends, right? So the instinct, the spiritual instinct, begins to subsume all the other instincts, and then this person becomes, an expression of that spiritual instinct. It begins to dominate. It becomes dominant, and that might be the same with an expansive warrior type who is just begins to be driven by the will to power, almost without any other considerations. Is that right? Because I'm trying to. I found your the instinct discussion part of your book very interesting. Is that a good way of thinking about it?
Well, I would say is simply that he would say that the priestly type, it's not like returning to the question, sexual drive. I mean, basically, what Nietzsche is saying, that the priest can't do anything else. It's like he's trying to put something nice moral sheen on something that he can't do. In other words, no woman's going to want him. He's not going to have sex. When he has sex, it's an uncomfortable sex. So therefore, he says sex is bad, and says that there's this. I'm doing it because I realize I'm in control of it, and I'm more moral than those other people who are having sex. Well, those other ones who have a more healthy attitude towards sexuality don't have a problem with it. They don't need to be told by a priest what they're to feel about it. Warriors, on the other hand, they do terrible things because their instincts are just out there before someone telling them these are bad, this is not right. They're just primed for aggression and fighting and releasing their instincts in the natural world, and then by chance, of course, they dominate and subjugate. But that's part of their instincts. They can't do anything. They can't do other than that, right?
And the verbal reasoning part simply obscures
so the
basic
priest
fact.
is all of a sudden trying to say, well, he could do other. The priest could say, what? Sorry.
Oh, sorry, I
Sorry,
think cut out. But I was just going to say, basically the reasoning self, the verbal self, whatever you want to call it, just obscures the basic reality of nature.
Well, people have different views on nature based on their own instinctual inheritance.
Yeah.
That's the point. I mean, the priest can only understand the world in relation to his own instinctual inheritance and bodily constitution. He can be honest and say, you know what, this just is who I am, and live with that. Or he could start trying to reinterpret nature so that he looks better. And the warrior doesn't need that because he's not interpreting nature. He's just being, right? He's just out there. And basically the priest is the one with the danger, however, what Nietzsche explores in the genealogy of morals, is when the warrior classes have, through their natural release of energy, have subjugated other people's, right, over time, and then created a higher social unit. But those people's wills have been pushed downward, have been redirected into the self, and that's the birth of the soul. In other words, they cannot release that like the warriors can. They are told that is bad. The warriors will punish them if they try to do anything against their social order. So they are thwarted selves, and that's the feeding ground, the fertile feeding ground for the priests to institute moral categories to explain that to them. Like, oh, you're bad not because you're feeling this way. The bad ones are the warriors, right? So it's the out of the subjugation of other tribes, became the fertile feeding ground for priestly interpretation of morality.
It's like he calls it like the great creative act, right? Because
yeah,
you think about the and I think he also says it starts with the Jews. If you think about the ancient Egyptians, who obviously enslaved the Jews, their symbol, their great symbol is the pyramid, which is the triangle, which is sort of very, very symbolic of hierarchy. Pharaohs at the top, and at the bottom you have the Jews and other enslaved groups.
Right.
And their great creative act is to turn that upside down. And interestingly, this is obviously just a
Mhm.
coincidence, but if you think about the Star of David, which is obviously a prominent Jewish symbol, it almost represents that inversion, doesn't it? It's like a triangle up
Right.
and a triangle down, and the high became low, the low became high. It was a
Yeah,
great
I never thought
creative
about
act.
that. That's interesting.
Yeah, but
Right.
yeah,
Hmm.
it's
Interesting.
interesting. Maybe we'll get into that in a little later. I do want to talk about that in greater depth. But of course, the book is about Nietzsche's relation with Darwin.
Right.
So let's talk about his early attitude towards Darwin. Nietzsche has this tendency to denounce everyone who influenced him. So you think about his early relation with Schopenhauer, he was definitely a student and a great admirer, same as Wagner. And I would also extend that to Darwin. You know, I think he admired Darwin's attempt to provide an amoral understanding of nature. And he also admired the fact that, you know, Darwin talked about fit and unfit rather than good and evil.
Right.
But obviously, at some point, he begins to separate himself from Darwin. But let's talk a little bit about what he admired about Darwin first.
Well, I think that he was the major figure that basically moved away from metaphysical, religious metaphysical explanations of man, and basically created a new paradigm where nature would become the focal point, right? It would have to be somehow explicable in natural terms. I mean that humankind is a product of humans, and so basically things like religion can also be explained along those terms. So I think there is a great overlap or an affinity for their projects have an affinity with each other. There's no doubt about that. Um, I argue, in fact, that if on the major questions, there's agreement, right? There's that man is a human animal, that morality emerged out of nature, that there is no God over this process, there's no Christian God, there is no. You have to come up with naturalist explanations for our human institutions, um, and yeah, so there's most of it is an overlap.
Okay, but his critique can be, according to the book, the critique can be divided into three parts. So, firstly, he critiques Darwin for arguing that life reflects a struggle for existence.
Mhm.
Secondly, he states that if struggle does occur, or Nietzsche states that if struggle does occur, it is not the strong, but the weak that prevail. And finally, Nietzsche
Right.
critiques Darwin for forgetting about spirit. So
Right.
we'll go through each of those individually. Let's start with Nietzsche's critique of the idea
Okay.
that life reflects a struggle for existence.
Well, as I said earlier, basically the whole idea of natural selection is that there's a struggle for existence. There's a struggle going on in nature, and there's also basically the instinct of self-preservation. He puts an instinct in man called this instinct of self-preservation, and argues out of that there's this brutal struggle for existence that and those ones whose traits are more conducive to the environment and succeed. So he comes up with this explanation. He uses, as I said, these categories of egoism, that man is a self-contained will struggling for existence. Now Nietzsche begins, as we talked earlier, to question fundamentally the notion of will. He's saying the fact that we are a will, the self-contained will, is already an interpretation of something that is not. We are a bundle of instincts and drives, and we don't are not in control over those. So basically, there's nothing that gets selected out. There's no individual will unit that gets selected out. What ends up being selected is totally willy-nilly and doesn't necessarily lead to anything superior. It's just it's that too is an interpretation that something is superior or something is lower, right? It's basically whatever happens to by chance. Nature doesn't care about what gets selected, and so it's only when we think of ourselves as self-contained will units that we think we interpret nature as somehow selecting something out of this process, when that too is a projection, an interpretation.
Mm.
So that was number one. What was the second one?
Well, yeah, number one is basically like that the struggle for existence. What he's basically saying is that these scientists, I think in the book you say, you quote him as saying something along the lines of they're plebeian types, their
Yes.
ancestors
Yeah.
were slaves, and that's why they view existence as a struggle, right? And
Right.
also there's that interesting point that I think Marx said that Darwin went to the other side of the world and he found Victorian England, and what he meant
Mhm.
by that was like the idea of struggle for existence was something that was actually a feature of life in Victorian England rather than a feature of nature. So even Marx said that, and Nietzsche really says something similar, which is that you're living in this culture that's at the time, I guess, increasingly overpopulated. There's lots of people.
Right, that's an interpret. He says so. Basically, that Nietzsche is conflating that with the interpretation and also where it's coming from. That's why he says it has a smell of urban overcrowding and everything.
Mm,
Because this is what they experience day to day. These people from the lower classes only perceive life as struggle because their life is one of struggle in urban environments, right? So for them to project that view into nature, even though that's already only a bubble of nature, it's not nature. It's just a little self-created or man-created world cut off, right? So they're going to see their own existence. They have their own existence struggle, and they're going to see that and going to project that. I was reminded of a funny story just related to that when I read a biography, one of the biographies of Darwin, when the author Ian Wilson is his name. He's a very interesting biographer of Victorian figures. Said that basically Darwin was in the South Seas and he was among these peoples there, islanders, and they were very open about everything, including their sexuality, and he's, Ian Wilson said jokingly, he said Darwin had all the opportunity to engage in all this stuff, and his Victorian morals prohibited him from doing that. And it's just like, well, that's what Nietzsche calls asceticism, right?
mm.
It's like, why are you not doing it? Well, because if it's so programmed by sort of Christian slash Victorian Christian morals not to be have such control of yourself, that's such asceticism that you cannot even sort of explore other possibilities like these islanders do. Yeah, they don't have any qualms about it because they're not Christian. So that speaks to your point about taking your own mindset, your Victorian mindset, into other worlds and thinking that somehow these cultures should reflect Victorian morals.
And then the second point, which I found extremely interesting, and I think we should linger on for a bit, is the point about natural selection leading to improvement. So Darwin recognizes that this is in some ways a pessimistic view, right? The idea of life as struggle and blood and gore and death, and the idea that the species. But here's the optimistic note, right? It's like, yes, life is struggle, but through that struggle, improvement occurs. And Nietzsche goes and says, that's not true. The species is not improving. Usually the higher types are the actual ones that are most likely to die out. And I actually think that's observed, even if we take to like zoology, the observation of animals, right? You think about rabbits, like rabbits proliferate.
Proliferate, yeah, I
Yeah,
know it's
yeah.
hard
For
word.
some reason, I'm just having but like crazy, right? You see tons of rabbits, but then, I guess the higher type of animal, maybe like a panther or something, you see that those go extinct often. And I think that this is under conditions of captivity, often those higher animals refuse to procreate. So
Mm.
anyway, I don't know if that's necessarily relevant to what we're talking about, but just the idea that the species just speak to the idea that the species is improving through this struggle.
Well, yeah, I mean, basically, the origin of species ends on this kind of sublime note that, and it's more than a sublime note. It's a metaphysical note. It's a transcendental note. Even despite the fact he's claiming not to be religious, right? It's this notion that, well, everything will turn out for the best, even though it's so horrible. It's this notion that that which is also has a very much of a strong flavor of the notion of the sublime that came out of the Romanticism. Out of like Burke, and it's this kind of the horror, the terror on the if you look closely, but there's something sublime about it, right? So yeah, he thought that somehow we should reconcile ourselves. We can reconcile ourselves with this horrible reality of brutal, survival of the fittest, because man progresses over time. It progresses over time, and the higher types emerge. Well, yeah, Nietzsche absolutely rejects that. He basically says, you know what? There is not a struggle. There is a clash of wills, because they're a clash. Everybody is basically trying to assert themselves, basically, and their viewpoints. And in reality, a lot of these viewpoints win out, and the people who have them are not necessarily the higher types. They accord well with what the majority thinks. So if one person reflects sort of a broader cultural cross section, that ideal might win out, but it doesn't make it true. It doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it true in a way, right? So it's just like the more people you have, that's all you have is more people. You don't necessarily having any progression at all. Progression is an interpretation, right? So it's an interpretation that, obviously, if you win out, right, in the 19th century, was a heyday of this belief that might makes right, right? Germany was right just because it beat France, and it had this delusion that we're superior to the French because we beat them, right? So it doesn't mean that they were more people identified with that, but it doesn't mean that necessarily anything superior emerged out of it. In fact, Nietzsche's criticism of the post-unification Germany was very harsh for that reason. That's a perfect example for him, where the right side didn't win. That's why he's a multifaceted attack on German society.
It's sort of like it's a Whig view of biology, basically. Okay, so maybe we could speak about the spirit, the last part. He criticized Darwin for forgetting about spirit.
Yeah, that's a complicated, complex section, because what he means essentially is that the weak actually need more spirit, right? Because they need to be clever. They need to be they are more intelligent, because they have this as weak, they need more spirit. So what he's basically saying is, yeah, it's the weak actually that require the spirit, but that doesn't make them superior. It just makes them succeed against other people, right? Who supposedly lack spirit. So that's what I think he's getting at with the term of the spirit, right? The more that you are basically subjugated or suppressed by something higher, the more you require spirit to survive and to sort of outwit someone. But that doesn't mean, and that's he realized, Nietzsche is saying that those kind of people will proliferate. Those kind of weaker people will proliferate and succeed. But he basically says, the Darwinists would say, well, that shows that they're actually superior because they have these kind of techniques, but they're using those techniques to compensate for an inherent weakness. So, for example, the ascetic priest, because he's not physiologically fit, will develop the spirit, the mind, to outwit the masters, the warriors, which the warriors don't need, because for their life requirements, that kind of guise is not required.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good way of putting it. I just thought maybe we'd finish by talking about Nietzsche's conception of sickness, which I talked a little bit about before. What made someone sick or decadent, according to Nietzsche?
Well, decadence is a very complex term with Nietzsche. First of all, it doesn't appear in his work until the later work. So there's not much occurrence of it in prior to Zarathustra and the middle period works. Earlier in his earlier work, he mentions decadence a little bit. He does mention it in those terms, I think, when he's still a little bit under Wagner's influence. But then it sort of disappears. And then it comes in with a vengeance later in his late works. And I criticize one book that talks a lot about this notion of the scientific notion of decadence, but in Nietzsche. But in reality, Nietzsche actually takes that term from mostly from a literary cultural essay that was written by Paul Rée about cultural decadence, right? So what the whole idea of decadence was really also emerged out of the writers from the mid to late. The French were the ones who grasped or wrote in this style much earlier than other countries in Europe at this time. So around 18, and Wagner himself wrote Tannhäuser and wrote his early operas in Paris in the era of decadence. So people like Berlioz and Hugo and all this would already be considered early decadence, and Baudelaire, of course. And Nietzsche was fascinated by these writers and this cultural period of real cultural. The French were the masters of this new movement and produced a lot of very fascinating works, decadent works. And he read the Revue des Débats, which is a French journal, religiously. He would always read the articles. He had kept a pace with all the developments in France. And he basically uses this term décadence that was applied to this whole movement and applied it more broadly and said décadence is this whole pessimistic view of society and looking at this view of despair and decline, sort of this, this also precise view of humans' psychological motivations, the interest in psychological nuances that the French decadents use. This was fascinating to him, and he's saying our period is infused with this spirit of decadence, of what the French were the first to pick up on, which then translated all throughout Europe. The French influenced the Russian writers. They influenced the French writers, right? Then it went over to Italy with D'Annunzio, and so this whole movement, Nietzsche and Wagner, of course, was the one that Nietzsche understood the best, and he was very close to Wagner and saw exactly the kind of character traits that were drawn to decadence. And so he basically, based on this deep awareness of Wagner's psychology, deep awareness of his own psychology and his own affinities to the decadent movement, he understood the movement earlier and better than and he was one of the forerunners of writing about this. And so what he did, though, is to apply it overall to the cultural critique, and said, this is a culture. We are a culture of decadence. We are drawn to questions of decline. We are drawn to overemphasizing psychological nuances. We are as a bourgeoisie. We are have now more time at our disposal. We read more. We're in our little rooms and we care about all the little nuances. And he says this is decadence. And out of that decadence came a lot of these theories. And so this is what I see him criticizing. So yeah, Nietzsche was his whole critique was of the culture of decadence, which was basically started in France and become a pan-European movement, and become basically he saw that cultural reality around him, and those writers who talked about decline, talked about degeneration, that was for him an expression of decadence. That too is decadence, right? Is the notion that somehow you you only focus on the pessimistic decline and the nervous energy and all that. But Nietzsche understood it because it was part of his own psyche. I mean, he is a child of his times. He could understand it because everybody was infected by it, so to speak, right? So the difference is that, however, as he says in Ex Homo, I overcame it. I understood it as sickness, so to speak, being realizing that my instincts were drawn to it. That's already a sign of decadence. But he's saying that by understanding, by basically plumbing the origins of decadence, of asceticism, which is also a response to decadence, right? So if you are drawn to things that are detrimental to yourself, but then you say, I am removed from it, that's just ascetic. You're not removed from it. You're also, the ascetic pose itself is a reflection of decadence. So Nietzsche was analyzing it at a far deeper level and understanding the psychological impulses that were behind these cultural currents at the time. Above all, the pan-European movement of decadence.
To simplify, the people who point out that society is sick are actually sick themselves.
Exactly.
And you think about someone like the best example of this might be Spengler, right? This idea, right, this cyclical view of history where we're in this winter phase, and you think that, and I'm not saying that's a incorrect view. I'm just saying that is very much a sign of a low energy. And even when you speak to people who hold those views, which I do often, I myself hold them, to be frank, right?
We all attracted it somehow.
Yeah, it is a constant dampener on the mood. And it is indicative of a sort of a sort of unproductive cynicism, which could itself be viewed as a form of sickness or almost a depressive malaise. A depressive malaise or something. Yeah, it's a very interesting idea.
So basically, in his later works, where he goes, I think when he talks about ancient Greece and everything, and he revises his view about Socrates and ancient Greece, and he says that what's different is no, it wasn't. He revises the view that he had about Socrates and the Apollonian, the Dionysian, and the birth of tragedy, because at that time he wrote basically he had more of that viewpoint that basically Socrates was a spirit of decline, and this was under also Wagner's influence, right, where he writes this work, and that it was a decline from the height of Greek civilization, which was the spirit of tragedy, and in his late work in the problem of Socrates, he says Socrates was in decline. Athens was in decline, but there was also still health around. It's just that that Socrates spoke to individuals in that society that were in decline. But Nietzsche says decline and health are always a part of our cultures. There's no such thing as a pure healthy society and a decadent society. Decadence and health are cycles in our own bodies and cycles in a society.
Yeah, I'm into bodybuilding, and it sounds so weird, but the principles of bodybuilding are essentially construction and deconstruction, destruction and construction, or anabolic and catabolic states. And you can think about that as really being a key to health, is that the organism actually does need to go through that. And what I was trying to say before about hormesis, right? I think it's a medical term where it's like a small dose of a poison can be beneficial. So I don't know if that sort of aligns with what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, it's also, if you think about it, it makes sense, right? If you're basically a healthy body, right? You can afford a couple of little sins, right? Because it's not gonna bring you down. But if you're drawn to heavy stimuli and heavy things, then there's something, your body is craving that, and you can't control it, right? But I mean, there's nothing wrong with being able to indulge in small. It's like people who smoke a cigarette here and there, right? I mean, some people have the casual cigarette, right? I mean, if they're essentially healthy, it's not going to damage them. right?
Mm.
It's just if they just smoke a couple packs a day.
Yeah. Well, you can even the example of the weightlifter is that like lifting weights is actually like a catabolic activity. You're breaking your body down, but
Hmm.
through rest, you build yourself up, and you could think about it like that, rather than viewing it as a inevitable decline, a stage in civilization that you can't really do anything about. You would view it as perhaps a stimulus to greater things. And that's Nietzsche's
Exactly.
sort of optimistic, strangely optimistic insight is that, yes, this is a time of decay or destruction, whatever you want to call it.
Whether the forces of the decay might be higher than the forces of ascendancy, but there's still ascendancy within that decline.
And or the current decay could be a spur or an inspiration to something higher, which
Yeah.
yeah, which I think is yeah, a sort of a more optimistic note.
Well, I think it's just a cycle, just like you feel it in your own body. There are moments when you're depressed and only the sad, you see only the sad and negative things, which is your instincts are, basically pulling you in that direction and making your mind think that, right? Whereas when you're not more optimistic mood, you don't notice a lot of those things. You're more immune from to them.
Mm.
You don't let little things, right? That's why he says that what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. If we are essentially don't let those little things hit us and affect us in a certain way, we won't even notice them, right? We'll just bounce right back. But
Mm.
if they damages us or like and really cripple us mentally, then of course we're going to see things negatively and pessimistically.
Yeah, and I guess you could again going back to this analogy for an older person or a weaker person, often a heavy stimulus will actually be a fatal blow. So if you get a an older person to jump down a set of stairs, it'll potentially be their end. But for someone who is genuinely healthy, that sort of stimulus is often positive. That
Hmm.
they will grow as a consequence. And I guess maybe that's a way of thinking about what Nietzsche was saying. It's like
Hmm.
this can all be a spur to something greater. And I do genuinely I think if I take one thing away from this conversation, I'm going to take a lot away. But if I take one thing away, I think it will be um, perhaps perhaps reevaluating that sort of Spenglerian view of the world. Perhaps that is itself a symptom of decay.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I think so. I think it's basically Nietzsche saw that the society was heading in the direction of excessive pessimism, and he's the forces of pessimism were outweighing the forces of affirmation,
Mm, absolutely. Well, I think that's a
self
great way to
affirmation,
end.
and that there's always that's this whole project is about self affirmation. Hmm.
Sorry, that was the lag again, but I was going to say I think that's a
That's okay. That's okay.
fantastic note
Yes.
to end on because yeah, I think that yeah, and thank you so much for your time. I think this was a very
No
interesting
problem.
conversation.
I enjoyed it very much. Thank you. It was very stimulating.
And I hope that in the future I'll read your work on
Upcoming work.
Zarathustra and maybe your upcoming work, and perhaps
Yeah.
speak to you again if you're open to
Yeah,
it.
sure, sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah. My upcoming work should hopefully be out next year if everything goes well. And yeah, it basically is an extension of this. I basically go on beyond Darwin and talk about Nietzsche's critique of modern science. So it's basically going further and realizing that the critique runs deeper than I realized.
Oh, that sounds very interesting. Have you got a title yet?
Tentatively titled Nietzsche's Critique of Modern Science, Dionysus versus Socrates.
Ah, nice. That sounds interesting. I also want to read your Zarathustra Nietzsche's Rendezvous with Eternity as well.
Okay, yeah,
Um, uh,
that's just Zarathustra, right?
yeah, yeah. All right. Well,
Okay, Russell.
thank you so much, Dirk. I
Sure.
really enjoyed speaking to you, and enjoy the rest of your night.
Yeah, you too. Thank you.
Thank you.